If you've watched this channel for any amount of time, you know that I love and use the Canon C70 often. I shot a couple feature documentaries on it, including one that won the ASC award for Best Feature Doc. It's got a beautiful Super 35 DGO sensor that is absolutely gorgeous and just creates this filmic image that just hasn't been replicated by anything under $15,000 in my opinion. But recently, Canon made a very exciting announcement. The successor of the C70 has been announced, and that's this guy right here, the Canon C80. And today I want to go through a dozen features that make this camera worth the upgrade over the C70, and one that might actually be a downgrade. First, some quick similarities. So just like the C70, the C80 has great battery life, nice controls, 4-channel audio, 2 XLR ports, time code, and a lot of other great features that make it a really nice cinema camera. But let's get into the upgrades. First is obviously the new full frame sensor. Now, when the C70 came out alongside the C300 Mark III, they were a Super 35 sensor in a world that was all about full frame, like the Sony FX6, FX9, and FX3 were all full frame cameras, and I think a lot of people overlooked the C70 because of that. But that DGO sensor was so much more beautiful than a lot of those other cameras that it really didn't deserve to get overlooked. But Canon heard the masses, they all wanted full frame, so we got it. And kind of the beautiful thing about full frame is not that it's any nicer of an image than what's on the C70, but all of Canon's best lenses are full frame lenses, like this beautiful 24-105 2.8. And so if you put this on a C70, you're getting more like a 36-150, 160, somewhere in there. So now with a full frame sensor, you get a shallower depth of field at that f2.8 at the equivalent field of view of something on the C70. So that's really nice to have. And the full frame sensor also goes into the next big upgrade, which is low light performance. So the C70 was no slouch. I shoot at native 800 ISO 95% of the time, but if you needed to go up to 1600 or 3200 ISO, no problem for that camera. But this camera has a triple base ISO of 800, 3200, and 12,800. So that full frame sensor just gives the camera a better low light performance, and I'll definitely do some tests on the ISO 12,800 to see how it stacks up. The last big improvement with the sensor is that it's now a 6K sensor. Whereas the Canon C70 was a true 4K sensor, this boasts more megapixels and therefore a higher resolution. It can also shoot 6K RAW up to 30 frames per second. So if you're doing more corporate branded content work and you just want that extra level of detail, the C80 might be the better choice over the C70. That full frame sensor also allows you to have a Super 35 mode. So with the Canon C70, it's always in Super 35 mode because it's a Super 35 sensor. But if you have a full frame sensor, that means if you're shooting 4K, you can get that extra bit of crop on your lenses. So that 24-105 can be a 24-105 equivalent if you're using full frame. But if you push into Super 35 mode, you have that extra reach that the C70 would give you anyway and still be shooting at 4K resolution. So having that extra crop mode is just really nice to have, or if you're still using old lenses like the Sigma 18-35, they'll still work on this camera if you punch into that mode. Now, some of the other big improvements are on the body itself. So first, I love this new top handle design. With the C70, they just give you one cold shoe port up top. So when you put your handle in, you lost any other places to mount accessories in terms of using cold shoes. So when you put on the top handle on the C80, you still have the hot shoe available to you here and a second one up here. So you have 2 places to mount accessories, where on the C70, you'd be left with 1. And this is also a hot shoe, so you can add some accessories like a wireless microphone that connects directly to the electronic connections inside the hot shoe, which is great. The handle is also just much nicer to hold. It has this extra little section right here that just makes the grip feel a little sturdier. So small things like that, but nice improvement. And while we're near the top of the camera, one of the big features that people lamented not having in the C70 was an SDI port, and the C80 rectifies that. Now, an SDI port is often used just to run a cable to an external monitor or a wireless transmitter, and it kind of functions the same way that a HDMI would, but an SDI is just a more robust professional setup. So great to have that included here, and it still has the HDMI port. So now you have 2 ports that you could run 2 external accessories. Now, like most cinema cameras, and specifically Canon cinema cameras, the C80 doesn't have IBIS. It does have an improved electronic stabilization. Now, the C70 stabilization was fine if you're just shooting a quick handheld shot of a building, for example, for some B-roll and just wanted to take the shake out of your prime lenses, for example. But the problem with the C70 stabilization was the stabilization seemed to be reading what was in the frame and then compensating for the movement in the frame. So if you're shooting a human and that person moves or gets up, suddenly the frame would jump with them because it's trying to stabilize them in place, which is a silly way to do electronic stabilization. Whereas the Canon C80 instead actually reads the movement of the camera itself and tries to steady that. And so you're not going to get those big jumps that you'll see in a Canon C70. I still wouldn't use it if I'm walking. It's not going to replace IBIS or a gimbal, but if you have it handheld and you're just trying to get a shot, then the C80's electronic stabilization is much improved and actually usable. So one of their big improvements on the body is that the monitor now has a nice little locking click in place, so that when you actually close your monitor, it feels quite a bit more robust and like it's not just gonna pop out and fly around. Whereas on the C70, as you can tell, it just kind of hangs there. And if you had a C70, good chances you sent in the monitor hinge because it started clicking or got loose. And that doesn't seem to be a problem on the C80 at all, because the monitor hinge feels much more robust, and that extra little click, I think, will help any wear and tear on that monitor hinge. In the C80 can also introduce some new codecs. So you obviously have the 6K RAW, which is not in the C70, even though it does shoot RAW, but it also has some different 10-bit options like XF HEVCS, and this just allows for longer running times. But in my favorite codec, the XF-AVC 10-bit 422, they also have some more interframe options. So not only do you have the 480 megabits per second and the 240 megabits per second, you have a 360 megabits per second. So it's just nice to have more options so you can control your file sizes depending on the type of work you're doing. All right, one more advancement on the body itself, and this is a small one, but they create a lot of headaches on the C70, and that's that they have an extra mounting point for your tripod. So if you look on the bottom of the C70, you would just see these 3 tripod mounting points. And if you had, say, your gimbal on the middle section, you're like, oh, I need to put a tripod plate on, take off that and grab your tripod plate and go to put it on there, there'd be no place to actually mount it if you're using one of the normal size tripod screws. And so you'd have to mount it off center. And I did this a lot just because I couldn't find one of the bigger screws in my bag at the time. Suddenly you're putting the camera on your tripod off center, which is a little weird, a little strange. It's not the end of the world, but it's annoying. But Canon has rectified that now because they've added another small little hole here that you can mount the normal size tripod on. And what that also allows you to do, since there are now 2 tripod receivers in the middle, is you can now have 2 screws, which I always like to have because it's just more secure and it prevents this, a little shifting of your tripod plate. Also another small addition, but was huge for me and something that drives me insane on a lot of cinema cameras, is that it finally has an electronic level on the screen. So while you're filming, you can actually see if your camera is level or not. And this is such a small thing, but it's such a big pain point because if you're shooting documentaries, you're moving quickly, you're trying to set up different shots. Sometimes it's hard to tell if you're on an easy rig or a SAC or something where you're just holding the camera, if the camera is just slightly off center. And then you spend time in post just straightening little lines by a degree or 2. I have no idea why this is not in every cinema camera, but I'm really happy to see it here in the Canon C80. And honestly, that one feature might be worth the upgrade for me because I hate shots that aren't level. So there are all the amazing new features that the Canon C80 has over the Canon C70. But there is one downside, and that is the lack of a DGO sensor. Now, a DGO sensor stands for dual gain output, and basically what it's doing is it's reading the sensor at 2 gain levels and then combining them in post to create a wider dynamic range. There's only 2 camera companies in the world who have DGO technology in their cameras, and that's ARRI, who you may have heard of, and then Canon in the C70 and Canon C300 Mark III. I think the main assumption is that the DGO sensor just creates too much processing power for a full frame sensor, especially in this body size. So if we are going to see a full frame DGO sensor from Canon, it'll probably be in a higher end cinema camera. So hopefully that's the case. Now, is the DGO sensor really that big of a downgrade? I think a lot of ARRI and Canon C70 acolytes would say yes, because the DGO sensor gives you a really beautiful dynamic range and does create a more filmic looking image. It's kind of hard to put your finger on, you just kind of know it when you see it, and it's one reason why this camera has such a strong cult following. So that's the one downgrade from the C70 to the C80, but this camera has so many extra features and upgrades that it probably makes it worth it. If you're in the market for a 6K cinema camera and want a more detailed image, the C80 is the way to go. But what's nice for a lot of newer filmmakers out there is that now these beautiful cinema cameras are selling for a lot cheaper on the used market. So for $2,500 or $3,000, you can get one of the best cinema cameras that has come out in the last 5, 6, 10 years. All right, so there you go, all the biggest upgrades that I really love in the new Canon C80. Are there any upgrades that you were hoping for but didn't get, or perhaps one that I didn't mention that you love? Let me know in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.